I want to welcome everybody back. We are our last final session of the housing track for today's OPD Planning and Zoning Conference is the New Hampshire Housing Toolbox. I'm excited to have with us today Sylvia Von Aulich, Executive Director of the Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission. June McCartan, the Principal at Outwith Studio, and Mike Tardif, Executive Director from the Central New Hampshire Regional Planning Commission. Just want to go over some logistics briefly. So you should see a meeting controls located in a ribbon at the top of your screen as depicted on the slide. There's icons to raise your hand, to open the chat box, and to react, and to change the screen view according to your preferences. If you have a question during the session, please put it in the chat box, and we'll see if it's a timely question. We'll do our best to try to get to them during the presentation. We'll also should have some time at the end of the session for questions and answers. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sylvia to take us through the first part of the presentation.
Thanks, Noah. Hello, everybody. So happy you're willing to stay in the afternoon and join us after a long day of listening. So I'm going to sort of take it from a 20,000 foot level, do a quick review of what we heard, at least in the Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission region, that's in the greater Manchester area. June is going to dive into the toolbox, and Mike is going to bring it home with sort of a conversation about the differences of rural and urban solutions and wrap it up for us. So a few things, what we heard in a nutshell from the folks in our region. Now, mind you, in the Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission region, we have a very diverse group of communities. We have 14 communities in our region, the largest outside of Boston, which is Manchester, and some very small communities under 5,000, including Francistown, that's 1,500. So we have both very urban and very rural. But so this is a sort of summary of what we heard. And from residents, we heard we really want low maintenance, low impact, smaller homes, where everyone, doesn't matter what size community, wants to keep the community character. And of course, everyone has taxes in the back of their mind and they want to keep costs low. From employers in our region, we heard about wanting thriving businesses and needing housing to make that happen, that there were housing shortages, and with housing shortages, there are labor shortages. And so every employer really needs more options near those employment centers. From developers, we heard they need more flexibility in regulations and shorter process, fewer hoops. And everyone's heard, of course, NIMBYs, not in my backyard. And what developers want to hear are from YIMBYs, I suppose, which is yes, in my backyard. From social service professionals, we heard a lot about needing more choices for low income and vulnerable populations. Not quite sure how to go to the next slide. Let's see, there we go. And just to verify, can everybody hear me? And now they're seeing a screen with 3 circles. Is that right, Noah? Yes, thumbs up. Thanks, Noah. So housing diversity, this was one of the questions from that we had as an online survey during the Regional Housing Needs Assessment outreach portion. And the question was, when thinking about housing in your community, please indicate your level of agreement with the need for additional housing units for each slated housing type. So if you see a lot of pink and red, people disagreed. If you see green, they agreed. So the first one is high-end housing, the second one is moderate income, and the third one is low income. So you can see people's opinions on those three. New Hampshire businesses. So 62% of the businesses in our region responded that they believe the housing supply shortage impacts their ability to attract, keep, and even afford to hire workers. 65% of respondents described the availability of housing options in or near the area where their business is located as very limited. And the majority of respondents said that their employees generally do not live in the same town as they work. Yeah, so why talk about all this? Because that input helped create what I'm going to refer to as the next steps. So we've heard a lot about very challenging issues with housing. Where do we go from here? What will the next steps be? So some low-hanging fruit, and I'm one of those. If it's low cost, let's tackle it. If it's no cost, let's tackle it. And I think you will find some of those low cost or even no cost solutions in the next few slides. So let's talk about beginning with community goals in mind. Every community needs to update their master plan if it's 10, 12, 15 years old. And so that's one of the most basic things communities need to face up is how old is their master plan? Does it reflect present community needs? And so getting community engagement, getting input, and then updating the goals of the master plan. And during that sort of process, also looking at, can we conduct a regulation assessment to identify roadblocks or unfair costs? And then finally, ensuring community master plans are in sync with zoning and other land use regulations. So you may be asking yourself, okay, well, for that master plan update, maybe we'll just do the housing portion. It doesn't quite work like that because we know, just like the knee bone is connected to the hip bone, master plan housing chapters also are related to community services, to transportation, to engagement and recreation. So we need to dive into that whole thing. Maybe you're wondering who's going to assist us with this type of work. Well, Mike and I are two of the regional planning commissions in the state. There are 7 other. There's 9 regional planning commissions in the state. If you have a small community and you don't have a lot of staff, you can reach out to your regional planning commission and perhaps we can figure out how to help you. And then there's funding, how to tackle these things. Right now, you've probably heard today about the HOP grants. And so regional planning commissions can assist with that as well. All right, let's talk about another type of solution. Well, that's allowing flexibility in your present regulations. So many communities have that one size fits all kind of regulation, like all lots have to be 2 acres or 5 acres, depending on the size of your community and typically how rural it is. So often this doesn't work so well. So what can we do? Planning boards can look at one tool, which is the conditional use permit method, and then you have a case-by-case consideration. You can also support reuse and redevelopment for existing abandoned structures. Close your eyes a moment or keep them open and visualize in your mind's eye anyway, your community or one that you serve if you're a planner. There's always an abandoned building. There's always abandoned structures or structures that are underutilized. What might those be? And when you have a developer that's come in and says, hey, I want to take this abandoned structure and do XYZ with it, have an open mind and help them work through that process. For infill lots, allow setbacks that match abutters. This is a real simple one. We all have communities where there's that strange little open lot between buildings. Well, if they had to follow zoning regs as is, often they'd have to have like a 25-foot front yard setback, 15-yard side yard setbacks, or whatever your community requires. Whereas the present on that neighborhood block, everyone's right up to the street or maybe 5 feet from the street. And so making it so that those infill lots, the setbacks just match the abutting lots, those setbacks, it's just that much more forgiving. So that's that kind of flexibility. Another area for low-hanging fruit is supporting community business. This is a big one. Look at that first top picture, help wanted. How many of you know from your own travels, your own community, have something like that in a business or restaurant nearby, a service station? We want to support our businesses. We want to make sure they can get the staff needed for them to be successful. So how can we do that? And first, that's allowing and encouraging employer housing to promote employment and housing opportunities. How might we make that happen? Well, let's rethink the commercial and the office and the industrial zones to allow multifamily behind the businesses. Often these are larger lots where up front on the street you have your business and nothing's happening behind it. Let's allow multifamily. So low-hanging fruit, doesn't cost anything. Consider the needs of the community. So by now you're already thinking, oh, master plan, input, visioning sessions. Well, during those visioning sessions, finding out what your present day community wants, not the community from 10 years ago, today. And so what we heard is from our residents in our 14 communities is that they want walkable communities. They want accessible village neighborhoods. And they want neighborhoods and homes that are low maintenance. And in other words, small is the big, small is the new big. And so, and part of this is because young people don't want to take the time to maintain larger McMansions, and the older folks who are like myself, who are coming to terms with aging, don't want to spend their retirement to fix up an old home. All right, what else did we hear? Listening to the needs of the community. As we know, New Hampshire is aging. One of the things is to think about is universal design and creating incentives or requiring a percentage of homes, new homes, follow universal design guidelines to ensure accessibility to people of all ages and abilities. So universal design guidelines, such as ensuring there's a first floor, main bedroom and bath, making sure the hallways are wide enough to accommodate wheelchairs or walkers, things like that. No steps going into the building or into a basement. It's all level. So things like that for universal design. DIY and housing. So New Englanders love them. I am a do-it-yourselfer at heart. The easiest way to create new housing in some respects is to make sure that do-it-yourselfers can bring in their own second unit into their own home. That's accessory dwelling units. That first bullet, make ADU development easier. ADUs, accessory dwelling units, it already fits in the neighborhood. It doubles the density when you think about it from 1 to 2 units. And it's a win-win for aging in place. This way, you can invite your adult children to move back and take care of you, or your adult child can build an accessory dwelling unit and invite their older parents to come and live with them. Peace of mind, right? Another thing is to allow for conversion of larger single-family homes into multifamily units. This doesn't change the footprint at all. Everyone in the community knows what they're seeing and they see the same thing. It's just a slightly different way of how you divide up that property. And then this one, the allowance for tiny homes and tiny home harbors. What I mean when I phrase it that way, tiny home harbors, is being an HGTV fan and loving tiny homes. We know so many communities don't allow tiny homes, and many of those younger people, especially fans of younger people, who want to not have any maintenance, housing, they'd love to own these things and build them onto a lot. Well, what if we had um, sort of neighborhoods where you could create parcels that became harbors, or they would allow to bring in 1, 2, even more tiny homes onto a larger parcel. That's what I mean when I say tiny home harbors. Um, density. Oh my. So density is not a 4-letter word. So often, as I said earlier, the one size fits all. This is sort of based on what? 2-acre lots, 5-acre lots. Why? Why don't we let science decide what the land can endure? And so science and innovation should determine the necessary water and wastewater infrastructure. And if we really look at soil-based density equations, this will ensure that the land is capable of the development. We put the burden on the developer to provide us this equation and provide us the information so that we can make a judgment based on science. Yeah. And I think this is my last one. Communicate the type of growth that the community wants. So often developers are unsure when they approach a community, just what does the community want? And so this is a visual guide. Londonderry in our region created the Londonderry Lookbook. So smart. The Historic District Commission tackled this with the planning board assistance. And what it is a visual guide for developers to ensure growth is in line with the community desires. How can you make this happen? Well, first research what other communities in New Hampshire are doing and going out and seeing the type of building that's popping up. You can take those pictures, put them in a lookbook. That helps. And then invite community input to provide examples of buildings, building details that honor their community character. So I think I'm going to hand this over to June so she can dive right into the toolbox.
Thank you, Sylvia. Hi, everyone. I'm June McCartan. I'm with a firm called Outwith Studio. That was one of the consultants on this New Hampshire Housing Toolbox. And I'm feeding into what Sylvia was saying about how to tackle these low-hanging fruit. What are the strategies that local communities can use to actually create more housing production? We created this New Hampshire Housing Toolbox. So let me make sure I can control here. Okay. So yeah, what is this New Hampshire Housing Toolbox? It's a collection of planning and zoning strategies for housing production in New Hampshire communities. And it's ranging everything from general approaches to how to go about housing development to really specific regulatory strategies that communities can employ in terms of zoning or likewise, and even some financing tools that local communities can employ. I will be diving into like the toolbox itself, but we'll just run through this presentation real quick as a sort of overview, and then we'll take a look at it. But to give you a preview, what are the deliverables what are the ways that you can access this housing toolbox? Well, number one, there's a PDF that you can see all the tools compiled in one place. And number two, soon to be launched, is a website that you can go to and sort of browse and filter and look at each tool individually. So I'll show you both of those things in the course of our presentation, but just to give you a little bit more background on how this toolbox came together and sort of what its purpose is. So we tried to answer for a series of tools. What is it? How can it help your community? How has it been used elsewhere? What does implementation look like? So what are the steps you need to take? And where can you learn more? So these are really a series of briefs, like primers, on what each of these tools is. And the idea is to bring you up to speed, as quickly and easily as possible, and then point you in the right direction for where to actually learn more. The audience is people working in and around local government, and so that can mean a lot of things, but we mean, say, local government staff, of course, but then also volunteer planning board members, select board members, members of the legislative body, maybe city council or town meeting, local advocates who are thinking about this. Even in some respects, getting more farther afield, it could be business owners who have an interest in creating more affordability in their community in order to attract more employees. Organizations working in the space. So it can go farther afield than just, say, town planners. But the idea is to be really people focused in the local arena, starting with town staff and then moving out. And again, the idea is to really just save time on upfront research, make each of these tools clear and accessible, so you sort of know what your options are, and then can try to construct a strategy around those available options. So how did this come to be? Well, so it's part of this RHNA process, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment process. And it was funded through ARPA. And it was a group of Regional Planning Commission staff, staff from New Hampshire Housing a little bit, and facilitated by the Office of Planning and Development. It was a subcommittee of people within this RHNA process who came together and started the process of ideating, well, what are the tools? How do we explain them? So on and so forth. And then at a certain point, a team of consultants was brought in, Outlet Studio. That's me and my colleagues. Came in to do planning content and visual identity to try to put this into a sort of more accessible product. And then a web design and development firm called Boku came and is building the website. So it was nice in that it brought a whole lot of people from different parts of the state into the same room, the same Zoom room, hashing out what tools are important to the local communities, individual communities in all parts of the state, and then having the consultant presence there, we could sort of look even farther afield and be like, okay, like what are the tools that are possible in New Hampshire, sort of legally possible, logistically possible, that are being used elsewhere, that we could sort of bring the insights from beyond New Hampshire into this toolbox as well. So we established the subcommittee from planners across the state. There was this big ideation process of coming up with potential tools. So I think the biggest list we had was more than 60 for sure, maybe more than 70 of tools that could be used, either zoning, funding, financing, general strategies, really ran the gamut. Some of them were maybe more targeted to nonprofit developers or even for-profit developers. Some of them were targeted to employers. How could they do that? But we really began to narrow this list, and part of that was really determining who was the target audience and what was the sort of level we were trying to hit. So through that process, we were like, okay, we really want things that local government can begin to implement, that they're not necessarily reliant on state or federal resources. They're not reliant on private actors, sort of coming in and galvanizing funding. It's like, how do we as local community planners begin to move the needle in housing production? So it's through that process of defining who the audience is and looking at how the tools could be implemented that we really began to narrow down the list. From there, we sort of drafted these briefs, sort of everyone pitched in and created content. We looked through that, identified and then ultimately filled gaps on sort of key housing issues facing the state. And then there was a process of feedback collection from people working in housing who weren't necessarily on the subcommittee. How is this structured? So just, I believe you saw this list for a second in the last presentation, but these are the list of tools that ultimately found their way to the toolbox. Accessory dwelling units, adaptive reuse, age-friendly neighborhoods, cluster housing, the community revitalization tax relief incentive, so 79E, form-based codes, housing opportunity zones, which is sort of a newer subset of 79E, inclusionary housing, infill development, missing middle housing types, manufactured housing, mixed-use development, planned unit developments, or PUDs, PUDs, reduced zoning and subdivision requirements, short-term rental regulations, tax increment financing, sometimes called TIF, transfer of development rights, sometimes called TDR, village plan alternatives, wastewater system alternatives, and then a workforce housing ordinance that sort of specifically responds to statutory workforce housing requirements. So that you can see it sort of runs the gamut there. It's everything from missing middle housing types, this very general idea, and sort of walk through what those are and sort of how a town might go about assessing those and ultimately implementing those, to things that are really regulatorily specific. So the community revitalization tax relief incentive. So it's this very specific tool, has a whole process tied up into it, and so we go through what the process looks like and get into some detail there. Each of these tools is then sorted by issues addressed. This was a way we use to assess, like, are we hitting all the things we kind of want to hit, the types of ideas that were identified in this RHNA process? What are the issues, and are we addressing all of them? And so we use these ultimately as filters on the website, or just sort of wayfinding tools in the PDF version. And each of these have kind of specific definitions that we state up front. But it's housing options, housing costs, so there's sort of a broad-based market affordability, the cost of housing in the market generally. Affordable housing, by that we mean sort of, capital A affordable housing, or workforce housing, housing that carries some sort of deed restriction on it, and might be rented or sold below market. Sustainable housing, multi-generational options, so sort of more specific carve out, but how do you make that happen? Infrastructure, so really infrastructure provision that would sort of lead to or enable housing production, and then redevelopment. So looking at, as Sylvia mentioned before, like abandoned properties, or properties that have been vacant for a while, that could be redeveloped, and also redevelopment of like downtown areas that may have be less active than they once were. And then each tool, we go through this list of what is it, how can it help, getting started. So that's getting started on the implementation process, and then considerations. So that's really like adding nuance or things you need to think about as you go through each of these things, each of these tools. If you like really wanted to implement it, what are all the nuances and issues you need to consider? And so those are all more like text-based, longer descriptive things. Resources, which is a list of outside, resources, either a news article or sort of a longer introduction to the tool, a description of how it's being used, maybe some academic research on sort of the costs and benefits, that sort of thing. So that's pointing you to more things to look into as you sort of like the sound of one tool and want to look further. Issues addressed, which is again that list I mentioned on the last slide. So is it addressing sort of housing options, or is it addressing like infrastructure? And there are each tool can have multiple issues addressed. Related tools, so that's things that are either regulatorily related or maybe tools that can be used in conjunction with one another to try to get them going more. Relevant state laws, so that's for some of these things that have specific enabling statutes in state law, we might link to that. And then case studies. So these we try to include case studies for New Hampshire communities of sort of different sizes and locations, but then also communities in New England and beyond New England that might not be in the same New Hampshire regulatory context, but have sort of lessons to teach us. All right, so how to get started. At this point, I'm just going to jump in and show you what these things are, this toolbox. But I think as general approaches, one way to get started using the toolbox is just sort of reading through. You could read through each of the tools, and sort of get an overview of sort of what the options are, or you could be more targeted in how you do it. But I think there's there's options to it's either a really great primer for the broad spectrum of things that New Hampshire communities can do, or it can be used with these issues addressed to filter down to the issues you think are most relevant to your community. So I'm gonna do something different, which I'm gonna stop presenting this PDF and just show you sort of the website and the PDF going here. So I'll appreciate audio feedback if this is working or not working. Okay, so let's take a look at first our landing page. So if you go to nhhousingtoolbox.org, which I'm sharing on the screen now.
It is working.
It is working, excellent. So you will see a very sparse landing page. Soon, in the next few weeks, this will be a fully functioning website, and I'll show you a sort of sneak peek at that. But on this nhhousingtoolbox.org right now, you can click this link, get the toolbox, and a PDF will come up and give you all the content that will ultimately be on the website as well. So just previewing some of this real quick, we have table of contents with all the tools listed, some introductory context. This is more or less a description of what I just explained to you now, sort of the process that went into it, et cetera, et cetera. A description of the structure, these sort of definitions for these issues addressed. So some more specificity there. And then there's this matrix here that can also be used as a wayfinding tool through the PDF to say, okay, for each of these issues, say affordable housing, that sort of deed restricted affordable housing, what are the tools that specifically relate to the production of that deed restricted affordable housing? Or say infrastructure, what are the tools that specifically hit on infrastructure? And of course can be read the other way as well, sort of for age-friendly neighborhoods, this tool we have in the toolbox, what are the issues that addresses directly? Then I'll just jump through, say, this first tool here. This is representative of how the rest of them go. For each one of these, we have this sort of explanatory graphic. Just try to quickly get into it. A description of what the tool is. So in this case, accessory dwelling units, sort of what they are from a physical perspective, and then a sort of brief on sort of what the rules are around them in the state statute. Bullet points on how they can help. So ADUs, as Sylvia was talking about before, they can provide age-friendly housing options for older adults. They can provide multi-generational housing options for younger adults, single parents, etc. Reduce demand for housing or sort of larger developments. Getting started is just this list of steps you can take. In many cases, they run similarly to the sort of steps that Sylvia mentioned earlier in sort of her next step section of her part here, which is like, okay, look at the master plan, hold visioning sessions, take, assess your local ordinances, work through amendments with the planning board, ultimately pass them, and then encourage them, the sort of uptake of those tools. Considerations, again, these are more nuances here. Here we get, for this one, we get into things like permitting and how you structure the permitting process for ADUs, financing, how a local ADU ordinance interacts with state requirements, that sort of thing. A list of additional resources where you can get into more detail. New Hampshire Housing has a lot of resources on accessory dwelling units. There's some work from ADU providers. These issues addressed, a list of related tools, and then ultimately the state reference before we get into case studies. And here you can see we go, different option or different case studies, communities that have implemented ADUs differently, Portsmouth, Swansea, and then looking farther afield, places like Wellfleet that have been on Cape Cod that have been sort of proactive in ADU production. And then much farther afield, Lexington, Kentucky, Eugene, Oregon. And, each of these has a description, sometimes images, and then citations where you can learn more on those. To give you a sneak peek of the website, so this is, not yet ready for full public release, but we have been building a website, and you can see here. Let me share this tab. So we'll have this website here, this landing page, which gives you, much the same intro spiel that I gave. Pretty immediately, we get into the strategies themselves. So, here's our strategy for age-friendly neighborhoods. So you can see that this is structured much the same way. This longer descriptive text is over here on the left. We have resources and case studies over here on the right. So the resources are just linked on the side here. Case studies, if you click read more, you can sort of, see those in action there. And then at the bottom here, we have links to the related tools that, sort of play into similar themes. You can see some of those themes here, issues addressed. So that's still very much in progress, but in the next week or two, we should be, well, I don't want to say a week or two necessarily, but in the next few weeks, we should be launching this publicly, and that will ultimately live at nhhousingtoolbox.org. So that's a general overview of the toolbox. And I know Mike Tardif of the CNHRPC has some further thoughts on how to use this toolbox in a local context.
Thanks, June. Can you bring that my one slide back up on the presentation?
Yep, working on that right now, Mike.
Thanks, Noah. Noah's always there.
Noah's always there.
So while Noah's working on that, to bring it home, I would emphasize the master plan process. And I appreciate Sylvia's note about all the chapters of the master plan, not just the housing chapter, but we do have more communities that are looking at the master plan update in a phased approach. So a couple chapters at a time. So, having that rolling review of master plan chapters and adoption of those at 2 at a time or 3 at a time. But I think it's important to go back and take a look at the tools and whether they're the specific approach is perhaps already in your master plan, or considering those tools and emphasizing the use of the potential use of those tools during the master plan update. And that really leads to building a base for making those changes, getting through town meeting, the education process, the fact that these things do take time. If you're building that base in the master plan, that can lead right into that implementation phase. I think we talked about reviewing the zoning and the regulations. I would venture to guess that the majority of communities have a cluster or open space subdivision section in their ordinances, but they're often very difficult to use. They can be, just difficult to navigate, where they could be simplified, or perhaps there's a policy conversation about whether you want to be more proactive and have some density bonuses within the cluster. So, maybe you have that tool, but maybe there's ways to improve that tool. Taking a look at right sizing your regulations, the width of your subdivision street regulations, the parking requirements that you have there, perhaps can be modified. But doing an in-depth review of the regulations, I think, is also one of those good initial steps. Some of the tools are more difficult to use than others, and to implement. Transfer of development rights is a difficult one. There's a lot of steps there. Whether and perhaps it's a little bit easier to modify your cluster ordinance. I would again emphasize, talk to your RPCs, talk to your local staff. The Invest New Hampshire program has opportunities there for funding for supporting regulation updates. So there's help out there. So seek that assistance. But the 9 RPCs, we love talking about these things. And I guess I'd bring it home with, again, the community engagement process. And whether it's through the master plan, but when you're embarking in one of these projects, certain sitting right now in late April for a number of these tools, town meeting 24 is a realistic goal. For some of them, though, it's town meeting 25 is perhaps a better goal. And these things take time, and use your opportunities to be out there to talk about. Anybody who wants to hear it, get the economic development committees involved, get the conservation commission involved. That's, you're going to have more success at whatever town meeting that you seek to bring something to, with that thorough community engagement process. And again, RPC staff love to help with projects like that.
To piggyback on one sort of meta comment as well, Mike, I think a lot of these tools, we had a lot of discussions in the subcommittee and sort of as we put the toolbox together about, enabling users to filter for like, well, what kind of place is this tool for? Is this a more urban or a more rural tool? And I think ultimately we decided against that, because all of these tools are really implementable in some way in sort of most communities. And say something like tax increment financing, which is a sort of complex dance you have to do to sort of enable it and get it passed. It involves a lot of legal work, financial work. there are things that have been used to great effect in more urban contexts. Places like Concord have used them to great effect. But they're equally as relevant, I would say, in contexts that maybe lack, say, public sewer capacity, but still want development, which might be a more suburban or rural context sort of thing. So again, talk to the RPCs. We hope that this New Hampshire Housing Toolbox will, I don't know, dislodge some of these notions that some of these tools are sort of just for some communities and not for others. And hopefully this makes it a lot clearer and sort of inspires action in communities that might not otherwise pursue them.
Thank you for that, June, because certainly you can right size the regulation or the ordinance for your community. So I think that was my effort with some help from June. Thank you to bring it home.
Questions for any of this? Noah, you're on mute.
Thank you. You think I'd figure that out by now. We have about a half an hour left for questions. If there's particular tools also that folks want to kind of follow up on or want some additional details on, either on the website preview version or the PDF version, or to just talk through, we also have time for that right now as well. I'm not seeing any questions right off the bat. Maybe I'll ask one to get things rolling here. So I guess it's probably more for Sylvia and Mike. Mike, you started to touch on this a little, but for some of do you have kind of, I know you said about some tools being harder than others. Are there some tools that you would kind of direct your communities, especially more rural communities, that feel like they don't quite have a lot of capacity, but they want to kind of dip their toe in the water and kind of move towards incentivizing more housing? Are there some tools that you kind of favor, would kind of encourage them to kind of look into? Obviously still following through the steps of first looking at the master plan, looking at what kind of the master plan says and such, but
I would start with that, Sylvia, that just taking a good look at your cluster ordinance and the difficulty in I'll go sit with the planning board. Yeah, we've got cluster. Nobody ever uses it. Okay, well, let's take a look at it, and whether it's the yield plan that's required as an element of that costs money and time, or the complexity of the ordinance. Can you simplify that? So I would start with that. Sylvia?
That's a good one. One thing that, especially during COVID, really struck me was all the businesses that had those help wanted signs. And, when you can't get on Friday night, your takeout chicken salad because nobody can work because they don't have enough staff, that really hits home because I don't want to cook Friday night. So I just think the assisting employers and creating allowances for employer housing is a really easy thing. I mean, we did that in Exeter. We looked at commercial zones and we created allowances for multifamily. And the single family residence sort of chaos that can happen when you have multifamily going in downtown or near, single family zones, That doesn't happen in commercial districts because you don't have residents living nearby. So the NIMBYism doesn't happen. And so that to me is really low hanging fruit. And not only do we get people then being able to support employer housing, now you've created more diverse housing in your community. So which may provide the community with sort of that step up on the fair share business. So it's sort of a win-win on so many levels. Yeah, and it's really selfish reasons. I want employers to have staff so I don't have to cook on Friday night. And yeah, I really, it's selfish. I know.
Okay, we have another question from Christine Robideau. Do you consider conservation, and this is an easy one, do you consider conservation development as cluster housing in the toolbox?
So also answered in the chat, but yes.
Oh,
So
great.
there's a number of different sort of cognate tools: conservation development, open space development, open space preservation development, or cluster, and we kind of all just group them under that name, cluster, because there can be pretty big differences between specific ordinances, but they often follow the same pattern.
Right. And I would say, especially for cluster, I don't know how much we talked about this, and especially for a lot of the other tools, consider kind of doing talking to developers, people in your community that are building to say, what is the problem with this tool? Why isn't it, we have a cluster development ordinance, it has a density bonus. Why aren't you using it? To actually kind of look at what are the kind of financial numbers, kind of putting pen to paper on a developer perspective. What are the type of incentive that a developer would actually need in the cluster development ordinance, for example, to actually come to the table and actually utilize that ordinance that would make it worth their while to actually build and utilize that ordinance? Yeah, I don't know, Sophia and Mike, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but.
That's a great question. I don't know, Mike, if you want to start us off. It looked like you were just about to say something.
I think, the question of whether there's a density bonus in there or not, and having that conversation. And, that's 15 years ago that you wouldn't have had that. I think that, we do talk about the ability, what the dollars are and the value. But the value of an additional lot or an additional housing unit is that brings that ratchets up the opportunity for that cluster to actually happen.
I know in the town of Deerfield, they're very conservation minded and very much into creating wildlife corridors. And so if it's over, I believe, 10 acres, the parcel, it has to be a cluster open space housing subdivision. And so it's a requirement. Yeah.
I think it's also always worth looking at the parcel size requirements of cluster. I think in some community, typically I see cluster ordinances with very high, overall lot size requirements of beginning at 10 acres or something like that, which you may find parcels that are that large, but not necessarily like parcels developers are interested in. So I think that's a kind of interesting one to begin to explore. And as part of a cluster process, you might want to look at like, well, what are the actual developable parcels of that size? How many of them are actually, soft sites that a developer might consider? And again, here's, jumping on what Noah said, like, here's where talking to local builders can be immensely illuminating.
Great, thank you. We still have time for some more questions. Are there other tools or questions folks have?
I just saw that comment about taking into consideration, I think it was developer.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really great comment. One of the things I've done before is make sure when you're working with the community on updating their zoning regulations or their site subregs, that the stakeholder team that you build to do that includes a developer, includes an engineer that works with landowners, so that you understand both sides of the story. We have I think often a better feel of the planning side of because we work with the town planners and the planning directors or the code enforcement officer or the planning boards, but we don't always get the story from the development side. And it's much easier to work with the developer when we're all sitting at the table and we get that side of it. And then the regulations that you build and create already have that sort of viewpoint built in. And so it just is so much easier.
I'll also say you should make sure when you're looking at different types of development that you're including developers with, say, experience in that sort of thing. I think I do a lot of work in Western Mass, and there's a lot of opportunities for mixed use development, but not every community has like a very active mixed use developer, and they're often more complicated projects. They're not projects that every developer wants to take on. So starting to build relationships with developers who do the type of development that you want to see in your community. So open space conservation development, very different than, say, a downtown mixed use project, and sort of making sure you have the right people at the table is really important.
Great. And I think the mixed use is another really good example where on paper, we all want mixed use development, especially in our town centers, in our downtowns and such. But, mixed use with first floor retail on paper and from a planning perspective is a great idea. But it's not always so easy off the bat. And maybe June, you can speak to this a little, to fill those first floor retail spaces right away. And so what you end up having a lot of times, can have happened sometimes, is that the housing comes in. You don't have an initial tenant for the retail space, and the developer, property owner, ends up having just kind of carrying costs for the retail space until they can find a tenant to take over that space. I think that's a great example where, mixed use is a great tool, and I think we should all aspire to it in terms of our downtowns and village centers. But sometimes there's this kind of financial overtone that I think that it's really important not to forget of kind of the difficulty in terms of financing some of these, using these tools in kind of the real world of a developer actually kind of utilizing them. Drew, I'll let you add on there.
Yeah, I mean, I find I talk to small scale developers and most of them hate mixed use requirements for this very reason, because it's sort of not it's sort of, especially if they're housing people, it's not really their area of expertise. They don't have like the context necessarily in the business community to fill something quickly. Even in very high value urban markets, it's often a loss leader in any project, because the retail landscape is very difficult in the US, and Amazon happened and everything else happened. So it's very difficult. This is, I think we talk about it in our tool, but this is where sort of the local knowledge of, say, people like the town staff or people on the planning board, or even a broader set of local actors, things like the like business associations, building relationships sort of deep in the community beyond just the developer world can help start to make those connections. So if you know a business that's sort of wanting to open, or sort of an entrepreneur who's interested in something, getting something going, a business that wants to expand, making that connection to the developer when you have the mixed use requirement there can be critical to actually make the project move forward. Because when you have that commercial tenant in place, it can be a lot easier to get the financing, and you don't have the developer sitting there not knowing what to do because they don't do commercial development. So at the local level, it's sort of all about the relationships and using the town's role as like central convener, as like to get the things that the town wants. So downtown development, vibrant community spaces, et cetera, et cetera.
Great. And then we have a question. Does anyone have insight into the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority's affordable housing project financing programs and requirements? I'm going to put a link into the chat to their main developer financing page. They have a lot of different programs, from the low-income housing tax credit program to the state affordable housing fund to some, I believe, some funds for supportive housing, to home funds. They all differ in terms of kind of their affordability threshold and how high for area median income kind of top level kind of income targeting. So I'm not going to pretend to try to be able to kind of go into those in details, and I'll just refer you to their website. Other questions, comments? I think some of you have been with us for a good portion of today. I think Sylvia brought up, or Mike, that there are still funds available through the Invest NH Housing Opportunity Planning Grant Fund, the HOP Grant Fund, for phase 2 regulatory audit. As Mike talked about, regulatory audit reviews up to $50,000, and regulatory development, regulatory change grants up to $100,000. As well. I'll put the link in the chat. Again, I think actually some of you on this call are actually in communities that are actually recipients of HOP grants, which is great. But just to know that there is still funds available if you want to kind of think about how would we take on use one of these tools, but kind of don't feel like you have the local capacity or the kind of funding in place on your own to kind of do this. It's a great funding resource to help kind of marry kind of further development of some of the development and implementation of these tools with actual funding to do that.
Just sort of I know we're wrapping up here, and just want to reiterate and encourage those folks who have stuck in it this long and late into the day. But as Mike put it earlier, there's some less complicated tools here you can use, some that your community has already done in the past, like updating master plan, like having a visioning session. And then there's some really complicated ones. So start simple, start easy. This is a great toolbox. It's got so much information here. There are other tools that I had gone over. So, start simple. Get a win. Get a win and then work your way up. And good luck to you. There are lots of resources. Thanks so much to Noah and his crew, all the regional planning commissions. There's maybe assistance in your own town, right there in the planning and building departments. So find someone you can work with. Don't do it alone. And slowly but surely, we'll tackle this challenging, time with housing. So good luck to everybody.
Mike, June, do you have any other thoughts? Again, we still do have a few more minutes. If folks, I don't want to belabor this session longer than it needs to be, so we can all enjoy the rest of this, at least up here in New Hampshire, gray afternoon that we have left of.
I would just emphasize, call your RPC with a question, or call talk to your staff. Like Sylvia said, there are some more difficult types of tools that they're going to take a while. So be patient.
Nothing to add. Just thank you to everyone who stayed through the session. Thank you to Mike and Sylvia and all the members of the subcommittee, and of course Noah for convening us all.
Great. And I would also say, if you're in a city versus a town, I think we forget sometimes kind of what especially on the zoning change side, kind of the work involved to get zoning changes passed at town meeting. Not to say to discourage any of you communities from kind of thinking big and taking on some of these bigger some of these tools, but that we also can't, as Sylvia said, we really don't want to forget that community engagement perspective and the work for the community engagement that's necessary. Really important to kind of get that early. You can get that consensus early on and buy-in makes the work at getting that zoning change and all the hard work that's gone into develop from a consultant like June or somebody else kind of writing a new ordinance actually pass a town meeting and actually get to the finish line. For our 11 cities and towns or cities and our handful of towns that have town councils that don't have to go town meeting, it's a little bit easier to get through that process, but for 90% of the state, have to get that. Any of this work is going to require getting it passed a town meeting. And so I think it's really important to remember to include that in part of your strategy. I think one of the great things about the HOP grant program that I alluded to earlier is the housing academy component of it and the community engagement component of it, of kind of talking about different community engagement and strategies and all the different ways of doing that. So it looks like Brewster might be putting something. Just a thank you for an interesting and helpful webinar. Great. Well, again, I want to thank all of our speakers. Sylvia Von Olick from the Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission, Mike Tardif from the Central New Hampshire Regional Planning Commission, and June McCartan from Out West Studio. If you have additional questions after today, feel free. I didn't clear this with any of our speakers ahead of time, but feel free to email any of them. Hopefully that's okay. Again, I want to thank everybody for sticking with us to the end of the day. I'm just going to put in the chat one more time, so you have it. The link to the our anonymous evaluation survey and form. We ask that you please fill that out for all the sessions that you attended today. And then the last thing before I close is that if you're looking for a deeper dive on some specific low-hanging fruit and strategies, Sylvia and I and Steve Buckley from the New Hampshire Municipal Association will be doing a webinar on May 18th as part of the OPD monthly plan webinar series called Making Zoning Work for Housing in Your Community. That's on Thursday, May 18th from 12 to 1:30. And I'll put that link in the chat as well.